So, good evening, everyone. I'm Dr. Peter Bateman, and I'm the Executive Director of the Association of International Schools in Africa. And we welcome you to this e-time webinar. This evening, we welcome Dr. Tim Stewart and Dr. Sasha Heckman to tell us more about their work around personalized learning. Good evening to the both of you.
Good evening.
Thanks for having us.
You're welcome. So we might start, Tim, with you. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about yourself and how you and Sasha got to know each other and how you became interested in exploring personalized learning.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. It's good to be with all of you. You know, ours is an interesting journey. Both Sasha and I have been educators for a long time, and we have a similar background in terms of our educational background. Both of us ended up in Asia in pretty high-performing schools. But I think realizing that what we were offering our students, which I would call a highly effective educational experience, was really certainly not enough when it came to equipping our students to thrive and to contribute to this ever-changing world of ours. And gradually, we started doing a lot of research around, so what does the school of the future look like? And as a result of that research, we came to some tenets that, interestingly enough, we both came to some similar tenets independently. And then eventually at a Near Coast conference, we ended up hearing each other speak on the topic and decided to join forces and to collaborate on a project together. So both of us, I ended up being the high school principal at Jakarta International School for a couple of years, then served as the high school principal at Singapore American School, and then moved into the executive director of research and development, which was basically my whole entire job was to kind of look into the future, design, identify the tenets of the school of the future, and then design a work flow or a strategic plan to get there. And it's at that point when Sasha and I met and our paths crossed.
Great. And Sasha, a little bit about you.
Yeah, and when I met Tim, I'd just come abroad from being a high school principal in the United States at a large comprehensive high school. And Tim and I, as he said, have similar journeys really about having certain educators in our lives make massive differences for us and knowing the power of learning and the power of individual educators. And so I was new to the international circuits, and I saw Tim at a conference, and I became a bit of a groupie, might have followed him around a bit, and asked him to have lunch with me because our ideas are very similar. At that time, I was the high school principal at Shanghai American School. And what I saw, I think we both experienced as kids that were doing some amazing things, but there was so much more left to be done to kind of harness the individual power of our learners and try to transcend education and make it kind of passionate and personalized. And if we can't do it in international schools where we were working, then it couldn't be done. So we started working together and started creating a framework of what would it look like. Also, I think that Tim and I both worked at schools where outcomes matter a lot. And so there was this idea that either you have to be a super, as we say in the United States, granola school. You have to be like soft on high academic achievement so you can give agency to learners. But that doesn't get kids into great colleges, and that wasn't really what our options were. So together, we started talking about, it seems to be a false dichotomy we've created, that why can't kids get amazing outcomes and pursue their own individual pathways and progressions. And so together we started working on that. So, and then we both looked to the continent at the same time, ironically, and ended up here, Tim in Addis and myself in Mozambique.
And that's to the AISA region's vast benefit, I have to tell you. I have to say I'm something of a groupie as well. So, Tim, we might start with you. As part of your research work, I think you and Sasha have visited over 150 of some of the most progressive and innovative schools in the world. So what are some of the trends that you are seeing and that we as educators need to be aware of when we think about future-proofing our students?
Yeah, that's a great question, Peter. You know, and interestingly enough, you know, when we started on this journey of discovery and looking into the future, we were ready to basically throw everything out and to start over. I mean, we went with what I would call in France carte blanche, about kind of rethinking education in its entirety. And what we found was that there were certain tenets that were absolutely the bedrock of a progressive 21st century education, which were things that good schools should be doing all the time anyway. And one of those was a collaborative culture. We found that the most progressive, most innovative, most successful schools had a collaborative culture. Teachers were collaborating with each other, students were collaborating with each other, teachers were collaborating with students, communities were collaborating with the school. And so this idea of, learning as a competition was just non-existent in these most successful schools that we visited. The other thing is that another tenet was that they all had absolute clarity in terms of what they wanted students to know, understand, and be able to do. Now, what they wanted students to know, understand, and be able to do may have been different because they chose it based on their culture, their environment, but they all had absolute clarity, from the board members to the administrators to the faculty to the students. They knew what they wanted to know, understand, and be able to do. Another tenet is that they all had systems of intervention and extension. So they all had the ability, when students weren't learning what they wanted students to learn, they had ways of doubling down and ensuring that kids were learning at high levels. And so those were things that we realized that we were A, trying to do, and B, we should be doing anyway. And so those were some of the really interesting tenets that came out in some of these most successful schools. And I'll turn it over to Sasha to kind of finish this train of thought. The one thing that we found that was different from what we were focused on was this idea of agency, student agency, and students owning their own learning, and students having an impact on their success. And I think that was something that we hadn't quite wrapped our heads around. What does that actually look like in this kind of environment? Sasha, you want to add to it?
Yeah, I think, part of our school visits was also finding some non-examples. And I think, people think when you go see amazing schools that are marketed as amazing, that you go in there and you're going to have your mind blown. And I think that was part of the disappointing part, is how many innovative schools are a bit more style than substance. They would be what we call learning progressive, but not highly effective. We saw kids doing really interesting work, but they weren't doing work for a purpose, and they couldn't tell you what they were learning, and they couldn't do the math, and they couldn't explain the physics. And they couldn't tell you how they were interpreting this piece of writing. Conversely, we had some schools that market themselves as really learning progressive, that were kind of just like our schools. They were high achieving schools with like cool rooms and some interesting programs, but really the goal was the meat grinder of getting into college. The few schools, as Tim said, that we saw all of those things present, had that collaborative culture, but what they also had was a really amazing focus on teaching learners how to learn, so they could take agency. These kids knew where they were in the learning process. They knew what their next steps were. They knew what they were trying to get done today, tomorrow, and next month. They knew what the success criteria was, and the teachers were hard to find in the room. They were with the learners, bouncing around. It looked like an architect's studio or design space. It didn't often look like school. And so when we saw people put this notion of progressive and innovation and really good learning together, what we saw was schools that were doing what we were doing, but doing it in a really different way that allowed learners to kind of take the steering wheel and drive their own learning forward.
You've both mentioned some two important terms there during that description. One was around schools being highly effective, and the other being learning progressive. Do you want to explore that a little bit more, Tim, and just tell our listeners what do those two terms refer to and why they're important in the work you do?
Yeah, I think for us, when you say a school is highly effective, the question is highly effective at what? And I think the answer for us has become highly effective at ensuring that all students learn at the highest level. And when we really unpack that, we realized that there were schools, particularly in international schools, that were highly effective. So they were effective because their students were high performing, or because their families were committed to education, or because their average IQ was above average, you know, so it's kind of the Lake Wobegon where everybody is above average. And so schools ended up, in our schools were schools like this as well, where we would pat ourselves on the back because we were effective at getting students into good colleges or getting good SAT or IB scores. And yet our systems in place were not we didn't have systems in place to ensure that all students were learning at the highest level. And for us, that meant becoming a professional learning community. And so, in fact, when we said, if we're going to be highly effective, then we have to double down on this thing that sometimes is considered traditional in terms of being a professional learning community, because that's the best way. The research shows clearly that being a professional learning community is the best way of ensuring that all students are learning at the highest level and therefore being highly effective. Learning progressive, and we'll talk maybe a little bit more throughout what this means, but is in some ways the other side of the coin. Being learning progressive means that the students are the ones who own the learning. And so on one hand, the highly effective side is the guaranteed and viable curriculum. It's the systems and structures you have for student intervention and extension. On the other side, the learning progressive side, is that students have a lot of voice and choice in how they go about demonstrating mastery, when they go about demonstrating mastery. They have voice and choice in what they choose to pursue as a matter of interest or passion.
See, we're going to come back to this idea of student agency in a few moments. Sasha, can I ask you, Tim mentioned this idea of professional learning communities. Can you just explain that a little bit more and maybe explore whether this creates an atmosphere where teachers actually are in some standardized procedural approach to their teaching, or, you know, creating a lockstep approach to learning or teaching?
Yeah, I mean, having been a public school educator, I've seen the worst iteration of professional learning communities, right? What professional learning communities isn't a meeting, it isn't a book, it isn't a regimented process. It's a way of living in an educational space. It's a culture driven by the 4 critical questions, really, that we want to have clarity on what we want students to know and be able to do. We want to be clear about how we know when they know it. So what are our assessment protocols? What are our expectations for learning that we're going to hold all students to? Question 3, really about what are we going to do when kids aren't learning, and what is our response going to be to that? And that builds a lot of efficacy in the educator about that I am the change agent. I'm the one that can make a difference for children. And then for those, you know, I call them the coasting A students, the ones who aren't being challenged, for those learners who already know it, how are we going to give them a different provocation, a different challenge? And the beauty of that process, it's incredibly open-ended. It's not at all limiting. It really honors the art and the craft of an educator to use their toolbox to meet the individual needs of students. But what it also does, that builds this notion of collective efficacy. One thing Tim and I really agree on is the fact that we've asked teachers to do something impossible, right? We put a teacher in front of 24 kids and say, okay, make sure every single one of them learns. And while we like to think of teachers as superheroes, because they are, to be admired in that way, the reality is for most of us, and myself included, that's not an ask. I can't meet the needs of every kid. I'm not going to connect with every kid. What professional learning communities allow us to do is take responsibility for all learners collectively, sharing responsibility for learning, and empowering us to give our kids the best of all of our talents, not the best of my talent. And so with that comes tremendous power, comes tremendous efficacy together to meet the needs of kids. So this notion that it creates a lockstep approach to teaching, in fact, it's exactly the opposite. Rick, before, if you ever went to one of the professional learning institutes, would say, most professional learning community books don't talk about how you teach, right? It's about how you think about your learners. It's about how you think about your process. You have the craft knowledge. You have the teaching ability to meet the needs of those kids. And if you don't, his whole mantra was, I bet you the teacher next door does. That the best resources for us are the teachers in the building. And so when we create that culture of collective efficacy, asking those 4 questions over and over again, what we actually do is we leverage each other's talents, we share each other's knowledge, and we're able to meet the needs of our learners. And there's nothing about that that's lockstep. In fact, it's incredibly creative.
Tim, anything to add on that? I think it's a key question, isn't it, around these professional learning communities.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll add to what Sasha said. I think, part of the definition of a professional learning community is that it is action research, and it's collective inquiry and action research, which means that as a team of teachers, we're going to look at the results, and we're going to say, what was the best strategy that any one of us used as a part of this team that achieved the results that we wanted, that kids were able to demonstrate mastery of the intended learning target. And then we're going to say, okay, if this is the strategy that you used, and that was more effective than the strategy that I used, then could you teach me how to use that strategy? I'd like to try that to see if it's going to work. And so it really is action research, because it actually encourages teachers to take divergent paths towards the same objective and then compare the results and say what works best. And I think as professionals, by definition, we are interested in using the best and most effective methods and strategies, so you could call that best practice, in our instruction. If we know that something works better than something else, why wouldn't we use it? And I think that's how we become better at our craft, is working in collaboration and saying, oh, that approach worked better than the approach that I've been using for the last 15 years. I might want to consider using that approach.
It's interesting that, because I have a sense that the teachers in our schools, in international schools in our region and across the world, are some of the best in the world. They have honed their craft. And it could be argued that as a result of that, our students, international school students, are going to be successful anyway. So how would our students in international schools benefit from these professional learning communities?
Yeah, I tell you, we have war stories on this one. I think the first, there are lots of different ways of answering that. But the first way that I'll answer it is around equity and fairness. I think often our teachers, and I won't argue with you that our teachers are some of the best in the world, and they have developed their craft. Our teachers have developed their craft over years and years and years of what works. But in some ways, many of them have developed their craft in isolation. And often they will not have common understandings as to even what a learning target even means. We are all coming from different backgrounds, different cultural backgrounds, different educational backgrounds. So when we read a standard as a teacher, we actually may not have the same interpretation of that standard as the person teaching the same class in the classroom right next to us. And unless we come to a collective understanding as to what that standard means, and then the next step is, what evidence are we actually going to accept as evidence that that child has reached that standard or demonstrated mastery? What does mastery actually mean for this particular standard? And unless we have a common understanding, let's say there's two teachers teaching the same course, we actually could be grading at very different levels, even though we think that we're assessing the same standard and grading it at the same level. And I think that that's just not fair. That's when we end up with, well, that's the hard teacher and that's the easy teacher. What we want is a guaranteed and viable curriculum being taught and learned by all of our students. Sasha?
If I could just add on to that, I think one of the things that struck me with this question is around the notion of what does successful mean. And one of the things that I found really compelling moving internationally is when I was a public school principal graduating high school with success. We are educating the children that can genuinely change the world. We have to maximize their learning. We have to empower them with the skills. We have to empower them with the attitudes, the confidence that cancer is solvable, climate change can be reversed. We have to inspire this younger generation. And I think the beauty of professional learning community is what your answer to question one is the prerogative of your school. So if the answer to your question one is we want good test scores, then sure, I'm going to tell you international schools are doing pretty good with that. When I walk into schools and I hear everybody say, we want our kids to be global minded, I see a lot less evidence of that work. When I hear that we want them to be connected to their community, I see a lot less evidence of that work. We allow those things to be really abstract and concepts. And we want kids to be global citizens, good people, embody integrity. These are words we hear in every mission statement in every school that I visit. What professional learning communities allow you to do is to decide what is your focus. And if you're nailing scores in traditional classes, let's go a bit deeper then. Let's make question one about how do we honestly get kids to make to value diverse perspectives. How do we honestly get kids to do authentic learning in the community? Because that can be as a question one, just like any other question. So the idea that professional learning communities are a constraint and they're really about test scores, well, that's just based on what question one you're asking. And if you're asking that question and your kids are doing well, take a risk, ask a different question. And then suddenly the protocol comes to life, because at my school today, we're at Ivy School, we're talking about their approaches to learning. We had 8 people in the room and probably had 14 definitions of what that meant, what the different things meant. And I think the opportunity to calibrate, to get clear for learners on what we mean when we say you're critically thinking, to get clear on the strategies we're going to use to help kids critically think, what it looks like when a kid's applied critical thinking to work. That is meaningful, deep, rich experiences for our educators, and it transforms the things we do. Yeah, question one.
Might be helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah, just to repeat what question one is. You work with it so closely, but some of the folks in the room might be thinking, yes, they did mention that. Now, what was it again?
Question one is, what do you want kids to know or be able to do? And so, you know, we have operationalized at our schools be able to do, because we want kids taking action with their learning, but it's what we want kids to know and be able to do. And that's straight from, you know, the PLC's Learning by Doing book. That hasn't changed in the last 25 years.
So one of the things that, sorry, go ahead, Jim.
We articulate it as, what do we want kids to know, understand, and be able to do? So it's kind of the three levels, which ranges everything from your common core standards to, as Sasha is pointing out, your dispositions of learning and your approaches to learning. So it's that whole range. It's not just, we're not just talking about content standards. Your answer to question one can be as complex and as high level thinking as you wish it to be.
Right. A question that I have, in this region in particular, we have quite a high number of very small schools, and I'm just wondering about the resourcing requirements. If a school wants to become a school that adopts this methodology around professional learning communities, what are the resource requirements to do that? And if a school has particularly limited resources, can they still do this in a resource-constrained environment?
Yes, absolutely. Again, this is not a program. Professional learning communities is not a program. It's not a curriculum that you buy. It's not like a curricular framework like the IB that you become a member and you're paying something. None of that. It really is a mindset or a way of being as a school. It's a commitment to really several big tenets. One of them is believing that all kids can learn at high levels. And the other one is that it is our collective responsibility as educators to ensure that all kids learn at high levels. And so if you make that commitment, then there are obviously resources. There are books available. Sasha mentioned Learning by Doing by Dufour et al. Others, I authored a book called Global Perspectives, Professional Learning Communities in International Schools, which is really designed as kind of the guidebook for professional learning communities in international schools, because there are some nuances. But it's not an expensive thing to do. It's about creating time for teachers to collaborate and guidance around what they should be collaborating around. So really, it's a cost-free experience.
I think, and also, Peter, I would say in my school, I mean, I came from a behemoth of a school in Shanghai to a fairly small school, although still large for the Africa content, about 550 kids when I arrived here in Mozambique. And I think, you know, again, if we can emphasize enough that PLC is it's a way of working. It's not something that you pay for. It's a learning. It's a great book by Aaron Hansen that's Professional Learning Communities in Small Schools, and he gives a breakdown of, how different ways to collaborate. I think the work we're doing tonight with the webinar is fantastic because it gives us an opportunity to say, in my school, for instance, I have one DP theater teacher. It's great to start a small cohort virtually of DP theater teachers that can collaborate, look at student work together and do this process virtually. Vertical integration in schools. And my middle school, I have one English teacher for 6, 7, 8, and they look at evidence vertically. They're doing this work differently. So there's many different teaming structures that schools can embody to get focused on learning and to ask those 4 critical questions. And obviously context matters. And on the other end of the continuum, working in a very large school, when you have 9 English teachers, it's a different problem. How do you get 9 people together? So I think, it's creative structuring and creative approaches, but where there's a will, there's a way.
It's interesting, in this particular region, we have a very strong tradition of sharing our knowledge between schools, and those communities that you're talking about, they're almost there already for the teachers. We shift a little bit now to this notion of personalized learning, and why is personalized learning so important to students today?
Yeah, we could write a whole book on that.
Well, I think you might have.
I think we have come to finally catch up with what I would say with the research that tells us that all kids learn differently, and all kids learn at different rates, and all kids are interested in different things. And that in order for kids to optimize their learning experience, that somebody like Lev Vygotsky in the early 20th century identified the zone of proximal development and said, if the learning that you're presenting to a child, whatever it is that you want them to know, understand, and be able to do, is too far away from that child or behind that child, then they're not going to be drawn to that learning. And learning is like a magnet. If it's close enough, if it's interesting enough, if you have the ability to be successful at it quickly enough, you're attracted to it. And that's why the gaming industry has been so successful, because they've been able to personalize the game in such that the challenge is always just right one step away from each child. And each child is attracted to it. They want to reach that next level so that they can go on to the next level. And personalization of learning is in some ways that. It's finding that place that is the perfect place for that next challenge so that that kid is attracted to it. Learning is a drug. It fills us with endorphins. We want to learn because it feels good to learn. We're designed that way. And I think right now, the cohort model that we have in education is based on the assumption that the teacher is in control of the learning, and so therefore it is impossible for them to personalize at 24 degrees. But so they have to basically differentiate at 3 degrees, and we're missing a whole lot of kids who are either bored or that it's too far out of reach so that they're disinterested because they can't reach it. So the personalization of learning is actually a way of being more effective at ensuring that kids are learning at the highest level. So I think that's one of the misconceptions, that people think that personalization is all about progressive education. It actually is not. It's actually about being a highly effective school and ensuring that all kids are learning at high levels by allowing students to personalize learning that is right for them so that they're attracted and so that they learn more and faster.
Thank you. Sasha, anything to add on that one?
I have a, as Tim and I offered this feels like we're having a cocktail conversation. This is I have a very different approach. I think if we're going to do justice to kids, we're preparing them for a future that we know isn't static. The knowledge base we teach them in school, some of it's already being debunked. Look at what quantum physics is doing to what we thought about Newton's 3 laws. So the reality is that the way of the future is knowing how to learn. It's not what you learn, it's did you learn how to learn. The more I get into this research, what I realize is this is an issue of social equity, social justice. My generation of kids, if I learned how to learn, I went to university. The kids that didn't learn how to learn went to the factory. And the factory doesn't exist anymore. Automation has taken that opportunity away. This is an issue of us preparing kids for a future where knowledge and information is ubiquitous. It is everywhere. And can you make sense of it? Can you continue to learn into your adult life? We're preparing kids where, when the research from Institute for the Future says that they're going to work 7 different careers in 4 different industry sectors. The idea of a lifetime job, learn something and do it forever, is done. The business of schools is teaching kids how to learn. And content now becomes the thing we use to help kids learn how to learn. Content is no longer the means to the end. Content is the vehicle to teach kids how to learn, because it's just like collaboration. When you collaborate, you got to collaborate around something. If you're going to learn, you got to learn something. And so the idea of personalization is really kind of focusing on how does each child learn? How do we teach them how they learn? What are their unique strengths in the learning process? And how do we allow a kind of a canvas of content where kids can express themselves so we can get the best learning efficiency for that particular learner? So, of course, we're currently, Tim and I talk about this frequently, we're in a transitional educational environment. Colleges still want test scores, but we know the future workplace looks really different. And so we, the highly effective learning progressive paradigm came from this notion that we got to honor both worlds that we live in right now. And it tears us in multiple directions. And so really the impetus around this personalization of learning is that we have to teach kids how to learn. We have to teach them how to have agency and be purposeful in the choices they make.
You've mentioned a few times this notion of student agency, and I know in your writing you mention it as well. Is it possible that you can just describe that a little bit more, and why is that so important to this notion of personalized learning?
I mean, simply put, for us in our book, we define agency as a student's ability to take purposeful action to a defined goal. So if a child knows what they're trying to come to, that's the highly effective target. This is what I need to do. Am I able to take purposeful steps to accomplish that? Do I know what I need to do to move forward in my learning? And so for us, agency is when a child has the skills of learning to do that independently. And one thing that Tim and I are very consistent about is, kids have agency. They have it right now when they play video games and they learn language online and learn to code. Kids know how to learn. They do that all the time. The number of kids I meet daily that learn how to play a guitar by watching YouTube is ridiculous. They have agency. The question is, are we going to allow them to express agency in the traditional learning environment? Or are we going to kind of compress them into an environment where they have to do what we want them to do because we have an idea of, we know what's better, so to speak. So I think, agency is really about the learners knowing what they need to do next and how to progress in their learning. Tim?
Yeah, I think, and that's why we talk about the tools of agency. We call it the learning process, where we're saying now that students need to be the ones asking and answering the 4 critical questions for themselves. So students have got to be the ones saying, what is it that I want to, or what do I need to know, understand, and be able to do? That's question 1. Question 2 is, how am I going to demonstrate that I know it? Question 3 is, what am I going to do when I'm not learning and when I'm in the learning pit? And question 4 is, what am I going to do when I already know it? And so shifting agency, if you will, from teacher agency, asking and answering the 4 PLC questions, to student agency, the students asking and answering the questions for themselves, is really the whole point of this shift that we're talking about in our latest book, Personalized Learning.
Let's come on to that then. The personalized learning notion that you're describing to us, are there roadblocks that educators or school leaders may face, or even students may face, in terms of realizing that? Sasha?
Yeah, I think for sure. I think that, one of the things that we focus on a lot is the skills we were taught as traditional educators. The reality is that we were taught to lead learning from the front of the room. I was educated in the classroom 20 years ago. My strategies were strategies to lead from the front. I think learners appreciate learning teachers that teach from the front often. So this tension about the learners engaging in the learning process is something we've created, and we have to unschool ourselves. You know, when you walk into, I love walking to early childhood classroom, and you walk into early childhood classroom where kids are exploring, they have lots of agency. So we have our least autonomous learners engaging with the highest level of agency. Ironically, the more mature kids get, the less agency we give them. So the more ability they have to be autonomous, the less autonomy we allow them to express. And I think that, you know, the more that we try to push content is a barrier. It is. I mean, you know, when you look at, I came from an AP school, there's a lot of content that kids have to know in a very finite amount of time. And I think those are real barriers and roadblocks that requires masterful teaching to overcome. So a lot of it is, you know, the old world transitional kind of approaches to learning that we have to move away from. We have to acquire new skills. We ourselves have to be learners of new craft.
You're just making, go ahead, Tim.
Yeah, I'll just piggyback on that. I think so. The teachers are obviously one of the greatest obstacles. We have to relearn how we do our craft, and going from, you know, the sage on the sage to the guide on the side to the meddler in the middle is a very difficult thing to do for educators and to wrap their heads around. I think the parents are also an interesting barrier in some ways, and you know, I've had some really humorous exchanges with parents who have been very angry with me that their child is doing all the work, and you know, I'm paying the teacher to do the work, but they're, you know, and you have to kind of say, well, so your child is doing all the learning? Yes, my child's doing all the learning, and I'm paying the teachers to. Yeah, okay, let's rethink that a little bit. So I think that that's an easy conversation to have once you have a paradigm around what are we actually here for? We're here to ensure that kids are learning. Is your child learning? Yes. Is your child learning more than they were before? Yes. Okay. Now we're on the same page. Those are really fun and interesting conversations to have with parents who actually get it pretty quickly. That's been my experience.
Yeah, Una makes the same point. Una is one of our participants, and she's saying that in the traditional learning styles, there's this sense that parents equate the quantity that is being given to their children with quality. And of course, what you're saying is that's not necessarily the case, that with you changing those roles where students have agency, then that no longer has to be. And she's also saying that if you wanted to do that, one way of trying to educate parents around this is actually to hold these curriculum meetings. I think it's a good point, Una.
Yeah, and I think, you know, for me, and that's why, I mean, and I agree with everything Sasha said when we try to disagree with each other, but then we ended up, you know, writing books together because we agree on a lot of things. So while we may have different approaches, ultimately we come to the same conclusion. My approach was very much when I started talking about that personalization is actually a way of being highly effective, is that we have now evidence of this in our math learning community, where we have multiple students able to progress through the mathematical continuum at their own pace and their own way, giving students voice and choice and personalization of a learning progression. And our math scores are better than they've ever been. Our traditional math scores are better than they've ever been. Why? Because students are actually learning what they need to learn when they need to learn it and demonstrating it when they're ready to demonstrate it. It's not 2 weeks from now when you already know it. It's not 2 weeks ago when you should have known it. It's now. You're ready to show me that you know it, so show me that you know it. And our scores are better than they've ever been. So our traditional measures of academic success are benefiting from our personalized learning experiences. And so, yes, while it does, learning how to learn is the absolute most important thing that students need to know, understand, and be able to do. Absolutely, 100%. But also, students are going to perform better in traditional academic standards if given agency and their ability to personalize their learning.
So, Sasha, you've just posted a few links into the chat box there that I think people are perhaps looking at. Do you want to quickly summarize what they are?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I would address that question with is this notion of perception versus reality. Human species are really interesting. We like things tidy and organized. It's kind of one of our schemas in our brain. There's a Harvard study that came out in September that they've been doing for a bit of time, where they've been studying university students actually in active learning versus what they refer to in the study as passive learning, meaning lecture-based kind of teacher-directed learning versus kind of messy inquiry-based learning. And the study found that students would typically report that they learned more in the organized environment because it felt better. Their perception of their own learning when learning was well organized was very high. But they actually learned more in the inquiry-based environment where the learning was messy, where they had agency, where they were forced to make choice, where they were forced to make decisions over their own learning. And so one of the challenges we have with parents is we believe we know what good learning looks like and feels like, when in reality, it's not what it looks like and feels like at all. I always like to make a corollary to the gym. If you don't leave the gym sore, you didn't work hard enough. Part of getting fit is being sore. And it applies the same to if you left a class feeling really good, maybe you didn't dig in hard enough. And I think that that's something that we use this word grit a lot in education, but grit implies challenge. Grit implies struggle, obstacles. And so if we want kids to be gritty, we have to put them in active learning environments where they're sorting it out and they're learning how to learn. So I gave that resource because I know my parents typically, if I cite things from Harvard, they appreciate that. There's some authenticity to that. So here's a couple of Harvard studies. One is actually the academic study itself, which shows you all the controls. One's a summary that, to challenge we have to start changing what it means, what it feels like to learn. If the teacher's talking all the time and it's all smooth, it doesn't mean you're learning. It means you're receiving, right? And you're getting input. Learning is really different. Learning feels different. And so we have to also work with our learners and our teachers to say, what does learning feel like? A messy classroom is a good classroom. And I think, the old paradigm when when the evaluators were coming to see me, I wanted to make sure my bulletin boards were clean, my kids were in their chairs, everything was structured. That's not what good learning looks like in the 21st century. It's a messy process. And if you go to Tim's Learning Hub in math, it's messy. You go to our kindergarten learning hub, it's messy. You go to his grade 4 learning hub, it's messy. Kids are engaged in real work, getting their hands dirty and really challenging themselves to grow. And so I think part of this notion, her comment resonates with me because I deal with this all the time. And it doesn't mean that our learning outcomes aren't clearly defined. That's a misnomer. All kids should know what their learning outcomes are. It's the process of learning is about the quality of the experience and the challenge the child receives. And that's what personalized learning does. It allows kids to make sure they're all being challenged, that they're in that ZPD+1.
So, Sasha, you've mentioned what learning feels like in a room. Tim, I've been to your school and I've seen for myself how some of this looks. Would you like to describe for folks, if they were to walk into your school, how would learning look in an international school that does personalized learning?
Yeah, so I think the one thing that'll jump out at people right away would be the fact that we group our students in learning communities. So we are moving away and have moved away from kind of standalone classrooms to what some would call a learning hub or a hub environment, where basically for us it would be the equivalent of four classes of fourth grade students, of third grade students, or of 3 classrooms of mathematics, all within a common learning hub environment. That affords us several ways of being able to personalize learning for students. One is that we have more adults in the room, and as Sasha was pointing out, when we're talking about a professional learning community, none of us have the skill set required to meet the needs of every single one of our kids. As a team, we certainly are getting pretty close to our ability to meet the needs of every single one of our kids. And we are able to regroup our students based on a lot of different things. Regroup them based on interests, based on aptitude, based on a whole lot of different, we can regroup them based on gender if we want to. And so we have a lot of different ways of regrouping kids that allow us to focus on more micro teaching experiences. So you'll have a lot of micro type of teaching experience. But the first thing that a student will do when they walk into a learning community is that they will basically identify what is their learning target, what is their question one for the day or for the week. And they're saying, this is what I need to be working on today. This is the mathematical concept or the social studies concept or the science concept or skill that I need to be working on. And I'm going to regroup with students. I'm going to regroup myself as a student with other students who are working on the same concept. And I'm going to utilize all the resources available, whether that's the teachers who are available to help me understand this concept better, or whether it's the internet, or whether it's my colleagues. So I can be in charge of how I learn it, when I learn it, and then ultimately I'm going to be in charge of demonstrating mastery when I'm ready to demonstrate mastery. And so that you'll notice that there's a lot of voice and choice and personalization going on. But the first thing you'll notice is that we've moved away from the standalone classroom and teacher experience to more of a learning community experience.
And Sasha, in your school, what would we notice if we were looking for a personalized learning environment?
Yeah, I think Tim took you to a bit of the systems view, and what you notice, obviously, if I took you to a classroom at our school where personalized learning is happening, I think the obvious things are kids are really in different places. You won't see kids working on the same stuff. They're doing a lot of different work. They have flexible seating. Some are on the floor, some are outside. They go where they need to go. Some have gone to talk to a different teacher. I think what's really clear is every learner can communicate what they're doing and why they're doing it and what they're trying to get done. The kids are incredibly clear about where they are. You'll see a teacher that's really engaging in a lot of data collection, a lot of formative assessment, just asking kids, where are you, tracking, doing a lot of observations, testing for misconceptions, seeing if kids are on par. And so you'll see a teacher engaging learners in a lot of conferencing strategies, looking at evidence. You'll see a lot of rich evidence around the room of work where kids have been given exemplars. They're comparing their work to exemplars. They're reflecting. You'll see kids engaging in technology use to document their process, because for us in a personalized learning environment, their process of learning is as important as the product. So kids are using tools like Seesaw or virtual portfolios to document their next steps and what they're doing next. And the other thing they do, which is I find incredibly novel compared to my own educational experiences, they're documenting their failure. So what didn't work and what am I doing differently next time? And so this culture of embracing failure within the classroom is working really well. We also have those learning communities now where we've rolled them up from kindergarten into grade 3 now. So we're doing a year each year. But I think many of our teachers are doing a great job with personalized learning within their own context, and across their teams, doing flexible grouping across classes, and leveraging some of the strategies Tim's talking about. But just an individual teacher, I frequently meet individual teachers whose school maybe isn't ready, but they want to dabble. It's really about creating those flexible options for your learners and shifting that pedagogy, and co-constructing criteria of what success looks like, giving them examples, and then letting them start to work. Asking kids questions like, how do you want to show me you know? And so when you see those things happening in a school or in a classroom, you know that that teacher and those learners are on a road to eventually personalize their outcomes. And I think that's really exciting. And parents, I'm going to tell you, parents believe it. When the kids can articulate their learning, they stop asking questions about test scores. Because kids come home and start asking about, the most recent current events because they read something that they connects to their research and the psychology of, of social media, and they're fourth graders. Suddenly parents realize that there's some real stuff happening in classrooms and it's no longer the stuff that we used to do.
Thanks, Sasha. So we've got about 10 minutes to go, and I would invite those that are listening and watching, if you do have questions, now would be a good time to type them into the chat box. If anybody missed how to do that, you just scroll down to the bottom of the screen and there's a pop-up that allows you to open up the chat box, and you can type in messages there that we can try to field in the few minutes we've got left. Both of you have written extensively around professional learning communities and personalized learning. I wonder if you could just spend a little bit of time telling us about those books, because Tim, thank you, you gave me copies of those books some time ago, and they are a good read, but they're a good read for a number of reasons. They're instructive, but they're also written in such a way that they can be used as resource books. Do you want to sort of explore that a little bit more and tell us what's in those books? Tim, you can start.
Yeah, I'll start with the global perspectives. For me, that book was really a collaborative project with a lot of international educators who were committed to professional learning communities, but realized that our why was very different than maybe a US public school environment. Why were we doing this? So while we all want kids to learn at higher levels, we had a very different driver for us. And so we wanted to write about, so why do we do this from an international school perspective? What does curriculum look like for an international school? I had various people writing chapters on curriculum, so which is question 1, on assessment, which is question 2, on interventions, which is question 3, and extensions, on inclusion. What does this mean for being an inclusive school? We also have a chapter written by Tico Ohms, who is at the International School of Basel now, on small schools. How do you create PLCs for small or singletons or small school environment? So we wanted to take all of the issues that we faced in international schools and put it in as one resource. That was kind of the impetus for the Global Perspectives book. And Sasha, you want to talk about the personalized learning?
Yeah, I think in a personalized learning book, we aim to take that work that Tim kind of codified in the PLC book and take it further and say, okay, now with all these experience we've had seeing, schools that are doing it really well, doing personalized learning really well through agency, through a PLC structure, how can schools take that kind of highly effective foundation and start meeting the needs of learners? And I think the chapters I reread and reread are the chapters around the different exemplar schools, the elementary school programs, the middle school programs, and the high school programs that are personalized learning. These are real schools just like us. And when I need a moment of inspiration, when the struggle is real, I go back to those chapters and reread those. But it kind of lays a nice foundation of how do you move from being a PLC school, highly effective international school, and start the journey. But one of the first things I would challenge most schools to do is to take a deep look and say, Jim Collins in Good to Great says you got to confront the brutal facts. So you got to we think we're really highly effective. Get into those highly effective chapters and challenge yourself and do a real honest assessment of, are you actually highly effective? Because I know when I did that, I realized I had a bit of work to do before we were ready to launch that journey. And I think Tim and I are hiring a lot of really progressive educators that we're constantly trying to tie back down to, hey folks, this has got to lead to a highly effective outcome. So that's a great idea and the learning intention. So you're just constantly bringing us back to that foundation of highly effective is really important. So I think the personalized learning book does a good job at kind of balancing those two narratives really well.
Great, thank you. And there's an opportunity coming up next February for anybody who's interested in learning more about this to bring a team up to ICS at Addis Ababa, Tim, to your school. This institute that you're hosting alongside Solution Tree, it's going to cover some of these key concepts around professional learning communities and personalized learning, response to intervention, assessment, student agency. Could you maybe say to the folks that are listening why, if AISA schools want to attend that, why would they send teams to that institute? What would they get from that?
I think the number one thing is that, Solution Tree is recognized as kind of the best in class when it comes to professional learning communities and putting on a learning workshop that has intentionality to it. They don't mess around. They do it well. And to go to a Solution Tree Institute, you have to travel across the big pond and go to a city in North America or in Australia and to kind of have this kind of experience. We're bringing that experience, that caliber of experience right here on the continent. So it's a direct flight away. You have access to people like Mac Matos, who are arguably the number one thinkers right now in professional learning communities, and an RTI. He's the author of many of the RTI books. So if you have a team of people that are really interested in kind of diving deep into the concept of PLCs and personalized learning, this is an easy way to access it. And the price is right. It's set for Africa.
Great. Tim, thank you. And Sasha, I noticed you have in fact put a link there that people can get more information. In the few minutes that are left, I see some questions are coming in. I'm not sure we're going to get to them within this hour, but I think what we might be able to do is to perhaps post your email addresses, and people could contact you if they have any additional questions. And then certainly the resources that you've posted online may also help. So Marguerite, we may not get to your question. I think it's about the MYP, but I think I will, get those email addresses posted in there right now. So you'll be able to contact these folks should you want to ask more questions. So, any final comments from either of you before we close this webinar? Sasha?
Questions? I guess what my closing thing is I think that one of the things Tim and I talked about often is that personalized learning is the destination and agency is the road. And I think the biggest thing that I think would encourage teachers to do, educators to do, is to start the journey. And that journey starts with making sure kids know what they need to know and be able to do. And then we start co-constructing what that looks like in success. And we have to make sure that learners know those two things. What do I got to do and what do I have to show? And then allow them to start taking some steps. And I would just, I think about the movie, What About Bob? About taking baby steps. You're baby stepping through each of this journey, and all of us started with the first step. So I would just encourage people to take those first steps. Join us and add us. We'd love to see you and have some personal conversations. And definitely email us. I'm Skyping regularly with people on the continent, especially passionate about our continent and helping our continent become the leader in this work. So please reach out. Glad to do it.
Thank you, Sasha. And Tim?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, bring a team to the Institute or send a few leaders to the Institute that'll get the appetite wet. And I think, happy to engage with anybody on this work. There are easy places to start. And, but the benefits of doing this work are immense. And I really now, having done this work in 3 different schools over the course of 12 years, I will never go back to a different model. As this is ultimately the most effective model that I've found through all the research and practice that I've done.
Great. So, Dr. Tim Stewart and Dr. Sasha Heckman, I thank you both very much for your input and for your descriptions of this very important topic. To everybody who's listening, thank you for your attendance. A copy of this video will be sent to you shortly after we've had a chance to top and tail it, as we say. So you'll be able to review it again. And as I said, if you've got any questions that you didn't have answered, please feel free to write to Tim or Sasha, and I'm sure they'll be happy to answer those. So from all of us in various parts of Africa to all of you in various other parts of Africa, we wish you good night.
Good night. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.